Welcome back to this part 2 of 3 on driving your leadership performance. Let's jump back in. About accountability and keeping us motivated and driven as leader. Um, Looking back at your, inner circle employees who were able to, challenge you and drive you, and you always say you like to hire for that, and you don't like having yes people around you, you know, talk to us about how you do that. How are you hiring the right people who are able to, you know, keep you honest, keep you motivated, keep you driven to motivate each other? Like, what are you looking for, and how are you able to make it work that it stays healthy?
So I think stepping back one sec is to acknowledge that not every leader wants that. Some leaders say they want that, but really they just want yes people, right? They just want people to quote execute or and don't tell me anything, right? And I think that's unfortunate. I think that um, totally using and taking advantage and driving the people who you work with to be the best that they can be is the way that the organization and the way you're going to be the best that you can be. So I think that I think that that's step number one. We want to do that. We want to make sure that we're hiring people who will speak up, not people who are speak up to be problematic, but people who are strategically aligned with what the organization's vision is and what for you as a leader, what your vision is. How to go about doing that. One of the techniques that I absolutely love, and some people will have heard of this before. It's not particularly rocket science. It's a concept called try before you buy, okay, or experiential interviews. The idea of saying, okay, well, rather than just doing a screening interview, a behavioral interview, a fit interview, maybe there's a quote technical or functional knowledge or industry knowledge kind of interview. No, I think that it's important to find a way to actually understand how that person thinks and just see that in action. Can you, for example, get them to do a case problem and present to you and some of your colleagues? Okay, can you see sort of how that might be written? Okay, if you ask them to write a report based on what they do, when you actually can see that interaction and feel that interaction on that particular case, not a made-up case, but something that is relevant to the work that'll take a little bit of time. And that's when you're serious about a real candidate for an important role. I think that's probably number one. Number two is the question of, okay, what do you do when you onboard them? What does that onboarding actually take place? What do you do? What are your expectations with them? How do you tool them up? Not just with respect to this is what we're all about and this is what your specific job is, but also about some of the challenges and the things that you're looking for them to help solve or to transform or whatever that thing actually happens to be. The next, pardon me, the next thing really is the question of what's the nature of the interaction. In the case of Ronnie and myself, we're sort of punching back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. How can I possibly be a great leader unless I don't have people who are an air marshal watching out and making sure that all of my blind spots are covered, right? And likewise, how can my direct reports or any of your direct reports possibly get better unless you're not doing the same thing for them? Not in a way of, gee, there's a deficiency, and therefore, you're only going to get 3 out of 5 on your annual performance appraisal, etc. But the recognition that we only get better when we're actively engaging with the people that you're working with is the only way that you yourself as a leader are actually going to get better too.
You talked earlier on the hour about encouraging accountability between colleagues and team members. Um, Many companies and startups, whether with a small skeleton staff or a larger team, even 80 employees or whatever, can still have a very flat hierarchy. So when it comes to their organizational structure, like what tactics and habits do you suggest, like a leader at the top introduce to that flat structure when you're not really reporting to someone, but you want that peer accountability?
Hmm. I think it's I think it's you know how do you actually make sure that the peers actually know each other? How do you make sure that they're aligned on the same page? How do you make sure that the vocabulary, the outside vocabulary that's coming in is common to all of them rather than everybody sort of going off in their own little things? How do you make sure that when it comes to what you're doing for innovation and creativity, using the same kind of methodologies and the same kind of language again, right? And where you're able to bring those cross groups together to attack problems that perhaps only one will not be able to do. Okay, and then there's the question of saying, okay, let's make sure we understand. And by the way, this isn't just a question with respect to smaller organizations, startups or 80, 100 people, but it's also just as much of an issue for organizations that have thousands and thousands of employees, right? But then it's a question of saying, okay, well, who's responsible for what? Who needs to be informed, right? Who needs to be accountable, right? There's a number of frameworks, RACI, RACI, responsible, accountable, consulted, or informed, right? And who needs to be informed? Okay, this is what we're doing. Who needs to be consulted? We're thinking we're doing such and such, any quick input, right? Who's accountable? Okay, at the end of the day, who lives or dies by whether this project, this task, this quarterly result, whatever it is successful or not, and who's ultimately responsible, for actually getting it done, right? And so sometimes you could use that kind of framework to do it when that's a particularly flat organization. The question is, how do we get people together? We've recently, in the last several years, are just starting to understand what the impact of COVID has done with respect to how we actually work as managers. And the whole hybrid in-office thing is also something that a lot of organizations are just kind of figuring out. So, I'm not saying that every single week we've got to make sure that we do this big retreat where everyone gets, every single month we have to do a kickoff on something or other, but there needs to be instituted in the organization mechanisms so people can actually interact, and I would say in person, right? We're doing Teams and Zoom, and we're just doing all this virtual stuff, etc. We need to tighten up those relations, these working relationships, okay, and start building some of that common vocabulary, the common methodology, working on some of these common projects together. And as a leader, that also gives you a chance to actually see with your own eyes what that team dynamic is, and whether it's particularly flat or whether it's a very complex organizational structure. This is kind of what builds some of these, call it unofficial wires between people, these relationship wires that collaboration and creativity, innovation can flow through.
Yeah, Randall, what you said has so much wisdom. I asked about accountability between peers, and your answer was create relationships and have the support and growth happen through those relationships. But as we know, when it gets very real at work and there's lots of deadlines and lots of clients, those internal touch points, become less and less. And maybe there is less relationship or less opportunity to grow those relationships, particularly with new employees, or as you said, work from home. We know that culture is very important and relationships with that at work is very important, but obviously the priority has to go to client work and deadlines. That's another question. How do you juggle all that? You're gonna tell your boss, I'm gonna delay the client project because the team needs more kumbaya time?
I don't think so. No, no, no. But that's a good question. Why don't we tack back for just a moment, okay, before we yet again deal with the question of accountability and talk about delegation. We kind of started this session off with that particular word. And what I want to suggest is we've all been delegating for years. We know how to do it. But have we been missing a couple steps in the delegation framework, if you will? I'd suggest that some of us perhaps have, me included. I mean, I wish I was perfect on this, but we develop a shorthand with those who we want to delegate to, and others that we want to keep accountable. And so let me just sort of walk through what I would suggest is a very, very complete delegation framework. And the question is for you listening, watching right now is, how many of these things have I not considered when I'm delegating? Because that ties directly to the question of accountability. and how you hold people accountable. Number one, you have the right person for the right task, right? Do you? Okay. The fact, and as a leader, you have a choice. This person is incredibly suited for that task, and this other person, on the other hand, might have more time available. So what do you do? Okay, so you've got to make that decision. Whichever way you make, you've got to make sure you've got the right person for the task, however defined. Number two is you got to make sure they understand it. Okay, the task, but also understand the deadline. Number three, you've got to hook why they should do it beyond it's my job to do this. You've got to hook why they do this to something bigger. You've got to motivate them. Why is it important for the organization, for the group, for the project? Why is it important that this task be done? And why is it important, secondly, for them, right? And why is it important to them? Well, it might be some career enrichment. It might be to build a new skill. It might be to be exposed to some new technology, some new partners, some new whatever it happens to be. It's a great opportunity, whatever it is, so that they tie that together. The next thing is to get agreement on the task and the deadline. Yes, okay, yes, the person says I can take care of it. It'll be done by such and such. So at this particular point, you're kind of done, but you're not done, because you may need to coach and support them if necessary. And if you do that, it's also a question of making sure that that coaching and support does not mean you're assuming they're monkeys. I think and the other thing that sometimes is missed is that we don't give 100% authority for actually completing the job, right? Because if we insert ourselves in the middle of it, and sometimes you need to, I get it, okay, is we sometimes can assume, again, that monkey, right? And if we're going to say, oh, please do it, but check with me first for every single thing, that's not really, that's not really 100%. That's not really empowering. So, yeah, there may be some touch points. And for you to say, okay, here's the monitor points. Here's the parts, the very specific parts where I need to be involved, or I need to make sure as a leader that I'm going to touch base and ask, how's it going? Okay, you don't want to be in the situation of it's like, minutes before the deadline and they tell you, I'm sorry, I just can't do it, right? It's much better to find out earlier, what are those touch points? And then you can provide the coaching and support. And then finally, at the end, when it's done, is to review it. Is it correctly done? Is it done well, is it fit for task, if you want to call it that? And I think, even though we're talking about delegation, and even though it might be done and it's done, it's fit for task. What's the reinforcement? What kind of recognition can you give them that reinforces that they did great stuff? Because whatever you recognize is what will be reinforced, and that's a very, very powerful thing. And that's about it. So if we're able to delegate sort of with that kind of thing, it becomes a lot easier later to hold them accountable, right? And say, listen, this is on you. This is not on you in a negative sense, but this is your responsibility. It's a serious thing that you're responsible for. And if they do a good job, then they get recognition for that. If they don't do a good job, or if it doesn't get completed for whatever reason, most leaders, they don't care about reasons, they care about results, right? But if you explore what those reasons are, you could determine, is this a systemic issue here? Is it a one-time kind of thing that, maybe could have been avoided if we just or I just did one little bitter piece, excuse me? Or is there some structural kind of change that's needed that this happened to expose, right? Or maybe it's not the right person that you chose to do the job. Or the right person who should be there at all, right? So I think that's really the accountability kind of thing. I think once that particular task is done, most sophisticated large organizations surely have got some fairly sophisticated performance appraisal system. And what can we do then to actually put the result of this delegation into the personnel file of that person? Because when it comes time for that annual review, wouldn't it be nice to have a whole bunch of examples of amazing things that they did, or perhaps something that might indicate a pattern of an issue that needs to be resolved, okay? Or maybe not so good a job, in which case that means something else. So, if you're giving that feedback right after the task is done, that gives them, in a certain sense, almost a bit of a do-over. It gives them the feedback in order to do better next time. But at the very end of the day, they're going to be held accountable during the performance appraisal process. Not just at the the time of task completion. So
Randall, we talked about you as as employee versus leader, partner, no partner. But what about your perspective as a board member, assessing the leadership performance of your CEO? What measures are you looking at in a world where nobody is perfect? What are the blind spots that you sort of want to share to people from that perspective?
Huh. So this is a very, very complex one. So I've been the head of a not-for-profit board. I've been a chair of the board for not-for-profits. I've been a board member of not-for-profits. I've been on for-profit boards. I'm about to step on a public company board, right? I've been a CEO of my own companies. So I've been there, okay. And one of the things I'd say, first of all, it's the relationship of the chair of the board with the CEO, which is probably more important than anything else. Because that's kind of the primary point for the leader to actually sort of have some of those conversations. And it's got to be a good relationship. It sometimes isn't. Why is it sometimes not? Sometimes because the CEO thinks that they're in charge of everything and they kind of don't report to the board, even though, thank you, they do, right? Sometimes it's the fact that the board as a whole or the chair of the board has decided that their job is the CEO, and they get involved too often in the operations of the organization. There's an expression in the governance world, and both Rodney and I have got board governance certifications. Noses in, fingers out. Right now, startup boards, okay, might be a little different because there may be a little bit not-for-profit boards that might be a little bit off as well. But that particular expression is really, really important, and it's important that the mandate of not just the board, but also the board committees is one that's very specific in terms of how far the fingers can go in or not go in, how tight they need to snip. They've got a particular governance responsibility that frankly is really, really important. So they've got it right, and certainly in public companies and private companies that I've been involved with, you've got a fiduciary duty of care to the shareholders, and sometimes beyond that. Not-for-profit world, you also have duties to the membership or society, or however it's particularly defined. So I think the idea of quote reporting to the board, there's some things that drive me absolutely nuts as a board member that is so easy to fix, which is this. We may only sort of have our meetings bi-monthly or quarterly, or sometimes it's monthly. So we're not involved in the day-to-day of the organization. We don't know everything that's going on between board meetings. We might not know all of the stuff that we actually need in order to make our decisions and everything, right? We can't remember exactly everything that happened, between quarterly board meetings, if that's the cadence. So what's critically important, thank you very much, is two things. Number one, a pre-reading package. So all the stuff comes well before the board meeting, so that as a board member, I'm able to actually read through it, understand it. Number two, one-on-one between the CEO and each board member if they're interested. So that way, some very specific questions can be answered, right? And it becomes a question there's a lot of things that you can deal with that don't need to come to the board, or rather will inform a good board decision because you've had those conversations earlier as a board member. As a board chair, you'll be a little bit more involved, right? A little bit more involved, but not massively involved if you've got a good CEO or a not-for-profit world executive director. So that's one part of it. I would also say this. In this client training, I just the other day, I talked about a concept. It's a Japanese concept called nemawashi, okay, which literally translates to rotating the root. But the short version of this, and this is good within the organization for leaders to think about, not just in terms of dealing with a board. Nemawashi means the application of nemawashi rather means this. Before, in Japan, there'll be all kinds of pre-meetings before the board meeting itself, just to get everybody on the same page, to make sure everybody's got. There's a little bit of we want to make sure no one loses face is part of that as well. But there's all kinds of meetings beforehand, and there's general agreement on exactly what the resolution of the issue happens to be. Then you get into the board meeting, And all of a sudden the conversation, yes, we all agree, all the hands go up. It seems like everyone's a yes person, if you will, but no, that's not it. All the tough conversations happen beforehand. And then the board meeting, all of a sudden the conversation is at a higher order. Okay, it's far, far, far better, right? And so the question I would ask for any leader who's listening to this right now, how are you using this Nemawashi technique within your organization when you've got critical meetings? What happens beforehand? What are the individual conversations? Not that you need complete agreement, but what can you do to make sure that, say, 80% of the issues are resolved so that, the group meeting is not taken up by, I don't know, stupid ideas, okay, waste of time stuff that should be done before. I had one CFO tell me the best way he deals with the board is he starts off by saying, I'll assume that I'll take it as given that everyone's reviewed all of the materials we provided beforehand. Where I need some help and how I'd like to use our time together is the following. And all of a sudden, there's all these great questions, right? And you do that once, okay? And people who might not have prepared so much, okay? It'll never happen again. Everybody will be prepared, right? And I think that's setting that particular standard of behavior, the norms, if you will, as a leader as to how you deal with a board, that's really good. Nobody wants on the board, that Pollyanna, everything's great. No, we've got to make sure that the board members are actually engaged in the conversation and involved. Because if they're not, they're going to say, one sec, how come everything's so perfect, right? It's not. This is a real organization. So what we really need to do is we need to make sure that you use the brains in the room to actually solve the problem, right? And I think that's something very, 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 very powerful. Because what will happen, and I've done this myself, is I've just put up my hand and said, listen, if you want me to spend a few hours with you, just sort of, digging into this particular concept, this particular issue, I'd be happy to do so. Okay. Meanwhile, I could see the relief on the CEO's head, so that's a good board. Some boards are very combative, right? Sometimes board members, in the not-for-profit world, for sure, don't know how to be board members. In which case the question is, just like the employees need an onboarding process and education, so too do the board members, right? So I've done this a whole bunch of times when I've led boards, right? And you'd be amazed, okay, how much people don't know, but once they do know some of these things, how much more effective they are as board members. Just a million times more important. And that means the relationship between the CEO and the board members who are now more effective becomes a lot more productive, right? So if you're not, for example, a CEO or executive director, you're just a bit further down in the organization, I challenge you that yeah, you do report to somebody. And why can't you use these same concepts with them? And why can't your direct reports use these same concepts with you? You can, right? That's leadership.
And Cam, do you have a question or a comment? We'd love to hear from you.
Leadership is tough. How do you know as a leader when it's time to take a break? How do you know what that recharge point needs to be?
Okay, so listen, there is so much to that question, Cam. It's really insightful. Let me suggest a couple things. Way back when, maybe it was in like I don't know, the book of Genesis. There was this thing called the Sabbath where people took a break, a vacation, instituted one day a week, a day of rest. Okay. So sometimes we forget about that kind of stuff. And maybe, just maybe, you might try doing your own version of a day of rest, whatever faith or beliefs you have. The concept is that's actually not a bad thing, just to disconnect. Okay, rather than being this 7 by 24 kind of operator. So at a very, very local, practical perspective, that's an idea you might try. Number two is the question of when you go on vacation, okay, are you actually on vacation? Or are you not on vacation? Because what we do as leaders, we train everyone around us to understand that when we're on vacation, we're not on vacation. Okay, so we got to make sure that, and by the way, Cam, I don't know if you like hiking in the mountains or cycling in somewhere where there's no cell phone reception, but sometimes you should consider taking a vacation in a place where there is no data plan. Okay, there are those places around the world that are that way, right? Or frankly, to leave your phone in the hotel lockbox or something. But the idea is that once you do that, you set the expectations of everyone around you, right? You do a bit of pre-work, you'll have to do a bit of catch up, etc. That's something that's recharging. Number three is the concept of saying, gee, is there a mechanism to take a sabbatical? Can I take 3 months off? Can I accomplish something bigger? Okay, and then go back. Sometimes it's a matter of going to one of these like advanced management programs at Harvard and all that kind of stuff. But that's not taking a break. That's a different kind of thing. But the idea of actually taking a sabbatical, for 3 months, for 2 months, even for like 6 weeks, etc., and saying, okay, how do I just reset a little bit? Build up the relationships with your spouse, significant others, with your kids, with your elderly parents, whatever it is. Go to the gym and do the carpools or go shopping. I don't know, whatever. But the idea of actually switching the mechanism is another way. Number four, okay, boy, I'm on a roll here, folks. This is a great one. Number four is what challenging non-professional things have you embedded as part of your own work? I can tell you for me, okay, there's several things that are very important to me. I really enjoy long distance cycling. It's my version of golf. Okay, I love exercise. I'm spinning every day or almost every day. Right? I love getting a sweat. It de-stresses me. I mean, I feel good about it. I love music. I've written a musical. How about that? Like there's all kinds of stuff that if you're able to embed, okay, same thing with family, right? Spending time with them. What are these things that give you energy along the way? So rather than saying, I need a break, when's the time, I got to recharge, etc., why can't we make it so the recharging actually happens as part of how we've set up our professional life, right? Number four is a bit more, number five rather is a bit tougher. What happens, for example, when you are exhibiting signs of significant burnout? Actually, let me just rewind that one a little bit. What happens when you're starting to think that maybe I don't have the same mojo as I had before? What is it that's actually happening here? I'm not saying, okay, go talk to a psychotherapist, because, if there's, mental health issues, that's what you should do. But very often leaders don't actually understand what the benefit of coaching will do. I'm talking about, business coaching. So, that's something that I do with CEOs and senior leaders. And by the way, I'm not an accountability coach. What are you going to do by next month? Okay, have you done it? No, it's really more, and it's not. By the way, let's do another Myers-Briggs type test, and let's do the colors and DISC, and so that's not the coaching that I do. It's more performance coaching and business growth coaching and everything. But having those conversations with somebody who's kind of been there and done that before, you're essentially renting the brain cells and the experience. You don't have to develop it all yourself if you could rent it. And sometimes you don't need a break. You just need a reframe, and you just need that other perspective outside of your friends group, outside of your spouse, outside of people who haven't done it before and aren't anywhere in your sort of snack bracket in terms of professional responsibilities, right? And I'd encourage you to reach out. Okay.
Cam, I commend you for your question so much because it's so real. And, when you think about leadership performance, people think go, 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 how to be better and more effective, more effective. We're all super effective. We have all the tools to be very effective. And at the end of that is this feeling of like, what's sustainable? And do I want it this way, in now and forever? So I guess my question, Randall, is when it comes to those questions of motivation and lack of motivation and lack of personal accountability, are there just natural ebbs and flows and cycles on that? Because entrepreneurs and leaders are naturally very driven. Those are their personality types, or they wouldn't be there, right? So when they're feeling stagnant or feeling lack of motivation, obviously there's stresses and different things that go in, but is that part of an ebb and flow, or is that symptomatic of something else?
Okay, yeah, you answered it again, Rania. So So you could tell we work together. Okay. So what I would say for that is how do we know that something is not just an ebb and flow, is not part of a bigger trend? Because we're smart enough to realize that if it's a trend, it's not a good one, right? And we want to make sure that we're a bit more preemptive in terms of getting on the track we need to get into. And this is a very different sort of a issue with respect to individuals, leaders who say, you know what, how do I get to that next level? Things are going well, I need to get to the next level. Sometimes you sort of hit a certain ceiling in terms of, almost any dimension. And the only way you can break through is by putting new inputs into that, right? And so when the ebb and flow is one where there's great stress or great moving towards great burnout and everything, excuse me, it's the same kind of thing. Unless you're putting those new inputs and new perspectives on it, not in a woo-woo kind of way, but in terms of practical things. The ideas I shared just moments ago about the weekly break, the sabbatical, the embedding things in between. These are practical things that you can actually try out and say, are these working for me? Right? And so whether you're saying, how do I make sure that this doesn't happen? It's just a cyclical thing, as opposed to, hey, I'm pretty good. Let me make sure that I need to up level. This is something that's very important. But to answer Rania's question specifically, there's no question that everything is cyclical, right? We have different times of the year where it's really stressful at work. If you're an accountant, for example, there's the busy season where everyone's filing taxes. At that particular time, it's going to be very stressful, right? There's other times, for example, where it's a lot less stressful. The Christmas break, for example, not so many people are working. Well, unless you're in retail, right? Or certain distribution areas, right? So there's that kind of thing. There's also ebbs and flows, personally. Okay, some people hate the winter. If you're in a cold climate, it's always dark, and there's no sun, etc. You feel naturally low. Okay, in the summer, oh, we're outside, we get the barbecue and a beer, and I don't know, whatever else, right? So I think that there's all these kinds of things. Then there's a longer sort of cycle that sort of overlays that, which is just the incredible opportunity of, for example, getting married or having a first child. Okay, or the tragedy, for example, or maybe the opposite of tragedy, if sadly a marriage breakdown, right? Or the death of a child, or any of these other kinds of things that hope they're not part of life, but these things kind of intrude because they happen, right? So some of these kinds of things, and we're only, as leaders, we are individuals. We're real people. And sometimes stuff that's outside the office affects our inside the office performance. In the same way that if you have a great day at the office, you come home and the world is great and everyone feels the love and everything. You have an awful day at the office, rah, 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 you're busy, growling away, and everyone feels that too, right? So it's very hard to sort of separate, on one side is one side the other. But at least if we're aware of what that means, it becomes a little bit easier when we're leaders. We're not all fake, right? We have to be authentic, and there's got to be integrity. And that's what kind of helps people sort of, that helps give us gravitas, because we're not some plastic whatever, but we're real people, right? And we can empathize, right? We're not perfect, right? But we are always doing the best we can. And then people sort of come to you, follow you, listen to you, because there is that authenticity, right? So we strayed a little bit from the cycle and everything like that, but I think I hope the comments help.
No, I think this is great. Randall, you said that leaders are real people too. A good reminder for all of us, and real people have feelings. And when you're, in love with your work and passionate about it, it's so fun to throw yourself into it and work all day and night, and spend like your free time you spend on the business because you love what you're doing. But what happens when you fall out of love with your business, or you feel yourself falling out of love? Can you remind you, I've spoken with entrepreneurs like that, with clients like that, where they're trying to remember their passion for their business. Is that a sign that they should move on or switch gears? Or is there in the same way we have to choose our partners every day, we have to remind ourselves that we love our business?
No,
With that, we'll break for this part 2 of 3 on driving your leadership performance. If anything we've touched on so far resonates with you, do reach out. We're happy to have a conversation and share resources. We are info@randall.com or find us on LinkedIn. And we'll see you back for part 3, where we're going to talk about KPIs and how to keep your meetings very productive.